Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. I am just an old lad that is trying hard to get by. Okay, let's dive into the story. The jungle had always been a place of mystery, a vast expanse of untamed wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon. As a ranger, I had learned to navigate the isolation that came with the job. The long hours alone in the watchtower, high above the canopy, were a mix of solitude and solace. Time to reflect, to listen to the heartbeat of the jungle, to understand its rhythms. I chose this life for the peace it offered, a stark contrast to the chaos I left behind. But beneath that peace lurked memories I tried to escape. And tonight, those memories threatened to resurface. That night, there was something different in the air. The usual symphony of nocturnal creatures was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin prickle. The wind had stilled, leaving the jungle in a state of unnatural calm. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars, scanning the dense foliage below. The full moon cast an eerie light over the treetops, and I could see the river glimmering in the distance, a silver ribbon winding through the darkness. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye, a faint, flickering light deep within the jungle. At first, I thought it might be a fire, perhaps left behind by a group of poachers. But the light was too steady, too controlled. It wasn't the erratic flicker of flames, but something more deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I hesitated with my hand over the radio. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the light, I told myself. But the unease gnawed at me, refusing to be dismissed. My past whispered warnings in my ear, reminders of the things I'd seen, the dangers that lurked in the dark. I put the binoculars back to my eyes, focusing on the source of the light. It was coming from a small clearing, hidden deep within the trees. As I adjusted the focus, I could make out figures, at least a dozen, gathered around a central point. They were too far away to see clearly, but their movements were slow, almost rhythmic, like they were performing some kind of ritual. A cold chill ran down my spine. Rituals weren't uncommon in these parts. Local tribes often performed ceremonies to honor their ancestors or appease the spirits of the forest. But this was different. There was something about the way they moved, the way the light pulsed in time with their motions, that filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. I wanted to look away, to retreat into the safety of the watchtower and forget what I had seen. But I couldn't. Something about the scene held me captive, drawing me in despite the fear twisting in my gut. I watched as the figures continued their strange dance around the light. It wasn't a fire that illuminated them, but something on the ground, something that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The figures moved in unison, their motions precise and deliberate, like they were performing a well-rehearsed routine. As I strained to see more, I became aware of a sound, faint at first but growing louder as I focused on it. It was a low, droning chant vibrating through the air. It wasn't any language I recognized, a series of guttural sounds and whispers that sent a shiver down my spine. The chant rose and fell with the light, each pulse accompanied by a surge of sound that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to lower the binoculars, my hands trembling. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it loud in the stillness of the night. I knew I should call for backup, report what I'd seen, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That I'd seen a group of people performing a strange ritual in the jungle? That I felt like something terrible was about to happen? Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a group of locals performing a ceremony, and there was nothing sinister about it. But the fear gnawing at my insides wouldn't go away. I glanced back through the binoculars, and my blood ran cold. The figures had stopped moving. They were standing still, their heads tilted back as if they were looking at something above them. I followed their gaze, but the sky was clear, the moon shining bright and unobstructed. There was nothing there, nothing that I could see at least. A sudden movement in the clearing drew my attention back to the group. One of the figures had broken away from the circle and was moving toward the edge of the clearing, toward the darkness of the jungle. I watched as they disappeared into the trees, the light from the clearing casting long shadows in their wake. A sense of urgency gripped me, and I reached for the radio, my fingers fumbling with the controls. I had to report this, Had to let someone know what was happening. But before I could speak, the radio crackled to life. A burst of static that made me jump. Watchtower 3, this is base. Do you copy? Over. The voice was calm, steady, but there was something off about it that set my teeth on edge. I raised the radio to my lips, but before I could respond, the voice spoke again. Watchtower 3, we've received reports of unusual activity in your area. Do you have a visual? Over. Unusual activity. The words echoed in my mind, feeding the growing sense of dread that had taken root in my gut. I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak. This is Watchtower 3. I've got visual on a group of people in the jungle, performing some kind of ritual. They're acting strange. I think something's wrong. Over. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought I'd lost the signal. Then the voice came back, quieter, almost a whisper. Hold your position, help is on the way. But something about the voice didn't sit right with me. It was too calm, too detached, as if it wasn't really concerned about my situation. The words echoed in my mind, feeding the growing sense of dread that was clawing at my insides. I glanced back through the binoculars, but the clearing was empty. The group had dispersed, disappearing into the darkness of the jungle. The light was gone, and with it, the sense of dread that had filled the night. But the silence remained, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I knew I should feel relieved that they were gone, but instead I felt more vulnerable than ever. They were out there, somewhere in the jungle, and I was alone in the watchtower, exposed and helpless. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The jungle was vast, and it would be easy to lose sight of them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I was there, watching them. I locked the door to the watchtower, my hands shaking, and began to pace the small space, trying to convince myself that everything was under control. But what had I just witnessed? Who were those people, and what were they doing out there in the middle of the night? Why did I feel like I was being watched even now, with the clearing empty and the night as still as death? The small watchtower felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in with every passing second. I kept glancing out the window, scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. The clearing was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. My eyes darted between the dark silhouettes of trees, searching for any flicker of movement, any sign of the group I had seen. Then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The underbrush at the edge of the clearing began to rustle, almost imperceptibly at first, but growing more pronounced. It wasn't the erratic movement of animals. It was deliberate, calculated. The jungle, which had been eerily silent just moments before, now seemed to pulse with life. A hidden, dangerous life. I swallowed hard, my hand tightening around the rifle. I knew I needed to stay calm, to think rationally, but the fear was creeping in, clouding my judgment. I forced myself to focus, to consider my options. The tower was elevated, giving me a clear view of the surrounding area. But if they had seen me earlier, they might know exactly where I was. The thought made my blood run cold. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but the jungle had gone quiet again, the calm before the storm. And then I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. It was coming from all around me, encircling the watchtower like a snake tightening its coils. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same chant I'd heard earlier, low and guttural, seeping into my mind like poison. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the voices were closing in on me, trying to push their way into my mind. I covered my ears, but it did little to block out the sound. It was inside me now, crawling through my thoughts like a swarm of insects. I needed to get out. The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. I had to get out of the tower, away from the voices, away from whatever was out there in the jungle. I couldn't stay here, trapped and vulnerable. I grabbed my backpack, hastily stuffing it with essentials: water, a flashlight, extra ammo. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the zipper, but I forced myself to focus. I slung the pack over my shoulder and reached for the ladder that led down to the ground. Just as I was about to descend, I heard something that made me freeze in place. Footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible against the dirt, but unmistakable. Someone or something was approaching the watchtower, moving slowly, deliberately. The whispering voices grew louder, more agitated, as if they were excited by the presence of this new arrival. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were directly beneath the tower. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was wouldn't look up, wouldn't see me hiding in the shadows. But then the footsteps stopped, and I heard a new sound, something scraping against the wooden support beams of the tower. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against the wood. The noise sent a shiver down my spine, and I clenched my teeth to keep from crying out. I forced myself to move, inching toward the ladder as quietly as I could. My only chance was to get down and run, to put as much distance between me and whatever was out there as possible. But as I reached for the ladder, I made a mistake. My foot caught on the edge of the metal frame, and with a loud clang, the rifle slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor. The noise echoed through the still night like a gunshot, and I froze in terror. For a moment, everything was silent. Then from below, I heard the whispering voices grow louder, more frantic, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Without thinking, I grabbed the ladder and slid down as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment my feet hit the ground, I took off running, not daring to look back. The jungle was thick, the underbrush tearing at my clothes and skin as I pushed through. But I didn't care. I had to get away. The whispering was all around me now, growing louder with every step I took. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, driving me deeper into the jungle. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get as far from the watchtower as possible. Branches whipped at my face, roots tripped me up, but I kept running, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to guide me, to pull me towards something. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my heart thudding in my chest. The jungle was silent again, the oppressive stillness pressing down on me like a weight. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the sound deafening in the quiet. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same. The jungle was a labyrinth of trees and shadows, and I had no idea where I was. Panic clawed at my insides, and I fought to keep it at bay. I couldn't afford to lose control, not now. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. But the light did little to dispel the sense of dread that clung to me like a shroud. A figure was standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking, and full of malice. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled me with a terror I had never known. I backed away, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam wavered, and for a moment I lost sight of the figure. When the light steadied, the figure was gone. I spun around, searching the darkness, but there was no sign of it. The jungle was empty, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. But I knew what I had seen, and the fear that gripped me was all too real. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. I turned and began to walk, my steps quick and unsteady, the flashlight's beam bobbing ahead of me. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The jungle seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. And then I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, seeping into my mind like a poison. I tried to block it out, to focus on the path ahead, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart racing, the fear driving me forward. The whispers seemed to be guiding me, leading me deeper into the jungle, towards something I couldn't see but could feel in my bones. And then through the trees I saw it again, a faint, flickering light. It was the same light I had seen from the watchtower, the same eerie glow that had drawn me in. But now up close, it was even more terrifying. The light pulsed with an unnatural energy, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. I moved closer, drawn to the light despite the fear that twisted in my gut. As I approached, the whispering grew louder, more urgent, filling the air with its malevolent energy. And then I saw them. The figures from the clearing were there, gathered around the light, their backs to me. They were chanting again, the same low, guttural sounds that had haunted me earlier. But this time, there was something different about their movements, something more frantic, more desperate. I crouched low, hiding in the shadows, watching as the figures continued their ritual. The light pulsed in time with their chant, growing brighter with each passing moment. I could feel its energy, a tangible force that pressed against my skin, making it hard to breathe. The fear was almost overwhelming now, but I couldn't look away. I had to know what they were doing, what they were trying to summon with their dark ritual. I burst through the underbrush and into a small clearing, my breath coming in ragged gas. The light was coming from a small cabin, nestled among the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of a fire flickered through the windows. Relief flooded me, and I stumbled toward the cabin, my legs shaking with exhaustion. I reached the door and pounded on it, my voice hoarse as I called out for help. But there was no answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily. I stepped inside, the warmth of the fire washing over me, banishing the cold fear that had gripped me for so long. The cabin was small, cozy even, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a worn leather chair positioned nearby. A small table was set with a simple meal, bread, cheese, and a mug of steaming tea. It was as if someone had just been there, preparing for an evening by the fire. But the cabin was empty. I hesitated, the sense of unease creeping back in. Something wasn't right. The cabin was too perfect, too inviting, and the fact that there was no sign of its occupant only added to my growing fear. But before I could turn to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the small space with their maddening chant. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the door was closed and the whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, pressing in on me from all sides. The fire flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving of their own accord. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the walls seemed to close in on me. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The figure took a step forward, and I backed away, my hand reaching for the door. But it was too late. The whispers had grown into a deafening roar, and the figure was closing in, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The cabin was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The figure reached out, its long fingers stretching toward me, and I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of voices that filled the air. As the figure's long fingers brushed my skin, a surge of adrenaline shot through me, snapping me out of the paralyzing fear. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything to survive. I reached for the nearest object, my hand closing around the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. Without thinking, I swung it with all my strength. The iron connected with a sickening thud, and the figure staggered back, a guttural noise escaping its unseen mouth. The whispers in the room faltered, as if shocked by what had just happened. I didn't give it a chance to recover. Fueled by sheer terror and the primal urge to survive, I swung again, this time aiming higher. The figure crumpled to the ground, its unnaturally long limbs folding awkwardly beneath it. The whispers turned into a chaotic cacophony, echoing off the walls in a frenzied panic. I stood there, breathing heavily, the poker still clenched in my trembling hands, staring down at the motionless figure. But I knew this wasn't over. The whispers grew more frantic, filling the cabin with a suffocating energy. It was as if the very walls were screaming at me, enraged by what I had done. The figure on the floor didn't move, but I could feel the presence of others, closing in, their anger palpable in the air. I had to act quickly. I grabbed the door handle, wrenching it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was a relief compared to the oppressive atmosphere inside the cabin. I stumbled out, my legs weak, but I forced myself to move, to get away from the horror I had unleashed. As I fled into the night, I could hear the whispers following me, but they were weaker now, more distant. Whatever I had done, it had disrupted their power, at least for the moment. I didn't dare look back, pushing through the thick underbrush, desperate to put as much distance between me and that cursed cabin as possible. I didn't stop running until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did I collapse to the ground exhausted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The jungle was silent now, the whispers finally gone, but the terror still lingered in the back of my mind. When I eventually found my way back to civilization, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But the memory of that night haunted me, especially the figure I had killed. I returned to the area later, hoping to find some trace of what had happened. A body, a sign, anything. But there was nothing. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed, and the jungle had swallowed up any evidence of my encounter.